Building libraries with React Native is hard. Where do you start? There's just so many questions. Do I do a native library, a JavaScript only library? Here I'm going to give a pretty low level description of what I do and how I think about this once I know I have a problem to solve. And I'm going to show you two examples, Burnt and Zego. Now this video is going to be a pretty relaxed. I'm just going to like go through it. It might get kind of long. I'm not going to cut it up a lot. I'm just going to talk you through freeform what I'm thinking when I'm building these, what the tech stack looks like, what it's like to work with native code versus only JavaScript, and a little bit more like that. And up first, we will look at Zego. So this is a menu library for React Native, and it lives in a bit of a middle ground between most libraries. You typically have either one that uses like native code or one that uses just JavaScript. In this case, I'm actually wrapping two React Native libraries. So if you've ever seen Zego, I can pull it up here. Let me show it here on the screen. It's a library for menus, and here I actually have a video describing what it looks like. Okay, I'll mute this. And so you can see here it's showing a menu on the right that's like a native menu for iOS. And on the left, it's going to do like you right click and it shows a radix menu. Right, so what I'm doing is I'm mapping the same API to both platforms, to iOS, Android, and web. And the question is like, how is that working? What was the approach? What did I do? So the way Zego looks, it looks like you're using radix. If you ever use radix, it looks just like this. You have these components. And the question is like, how does that get turned into an iOS menu? And it's using a lot of magic. So while this is a pretty uncommon React Native kind of library you're going to do, I'm just going to like literally pull up the code for Zego and show you it because I think it's a pretty fun thing to look through. The main reason being I'm breaking a lot of rules of React when I'm building this library. So just to show you the API again, you have these like menu items and they're all in components. So I'm basically just turning those menu items into something that this library can use. So see here on Android, and then there's a different one for iOS, but I'll just like focus on one of them for now. Basically this library takes in an array and then of actions, and then those have like sub items and stuff like that. I wasn't a huge fan of this API. I much preferred the radix one. And I also wanted to be able to use radix on web. So I was like, all right, what could I do here to make this work? And so again, this is what the API looks like. Now there's one like limitation of Zego, which is it only lets you use components directly as a child. So here you have like content and then you have item, but item has to be a direct child. And if you want to like have it be nested inside of something, you need to do a custom component thing here. So here it's like this isn't allowed. And the reason is because I'm literally mapping children and turning it into an array. So it's kind of confusing. I'll just show you some code. The first thing Zego does, so I have this file called create iOS menu and create Android menu. Each one of these only works for that platform. So I'll go to the create iOS menu, and this is just like a super like what is going on here. Basically, what I'm doing is I'm creating all these components like trigger, group, content, everything that like looks like it's like a radix component. But those are all just like fake components. Right? Because React has these APIs that lets you literally traverse the components someone is using and like read in their props. So technically when you're using Zego, you're using JSX, but it's all an illusion. You're actually just passing me an array and I'm mapping over that array of components, extracting their props and forwarding it down to the underlying native library. Notice that like this is just all the components from Radix's menu put right here, and most of them just are returning empty. Like how does that work? Right? There's just these components that are returning empty. Well, they're just there for what would be called like syntactic sugar, right? It looks nice when you're building it, but it's not actually doing anything. And what I'm going to show you in a second is how whenever you write an item, I'm actually just reading in the props in a different time. So here's the item component, for example. It returns nothing, right? It returns the child, but technically this could just return empty. And all it's doing is validating the props, okay? So where's all the magic happening? Well, we're going to start at the root, right? So if I go back to Zego, here the root drop-down menu .root, this is like the parent-most component. So the root, the first thing it has to do is just traverse its children. It's going to loop through every child and identify what types they are. So I'm going to go all the way to the bottom here and I have the root, okay? So for the root, I have this function called pickChildren and I'm passing it the props.children. What this does is it's a really like kind of weird function where you basically give it arbitrary JSX elements and it flattens them and extracts the keys and does a little bit of magic there. And then it basically says, give me back all the children that match the type of this other component. So if I just go back here, I'm saying, give me back all the children that are triggers. So if you pass a trigger as a direct child of the root, it'll return those in an array. Okay. So here's, I have the trigger child. And then I'm also want the same thing for content. Give me the direct child that is content here. So pick children, props.children, and then content. And it returns the ones that do and don't match. So given that you can only have one content, I'm just getting the 0th one. And then I just like continually doing that, right? So items go inside of content. So I have this really big function called get item from child and then map items children. Okay, so these two are just like helper functions and they're just put inside of the root. So the first thing that happens here is like, what are the items that are gonna get passed to the underlying menu component? Okay, and that is where this variable menu items comes in. So I have this function that is called map items children. It loops over the children of content. So they're the children of content. If I go back to this, we're gonna have like a label, an item, a group, a checkbox item, a sub, right? So we have all these possible children, and we're just gonna recursively go through all the children of content and get, based on the type of each thing, add it to this items array, right? So we're initializing an array and we need to push items to it. So here I have map items children and I'm just filtering out the ones that don't exist and I'm passing it the children of content, right? So it's literally like, looks like cheating. You can literally do content dot props dot children, and content is the literal component. So this is a little unknown thing that React really tells you shouldn't do. It's kind of like a somewhat of a private-ish API where you can straight up like extract the children of a component using some of their helper functions. It's really weird. So I'm going to show you this here. Again, this is like illegal React in a way. So I have this function map items children, and it's looping over all of content's children. First, it flattens them. This is just like a convenience function. And then I have all these conditions of like, what is each child an instance of? So the child, if it's an item, I do one thing with it. If it's a checkbox item, I do something else. If it's a sub, which is like a nested menu, or if it's a group. And each one of these is going to have its own behavior of how it gets passed to the underlying array of either React Native menu on Android or React Native iOS context menu on iOS. So here I have a function is instance of component. This is actually what's used under the hood by the previous function I showed, which is pick children. So if I get is instance of a component, it's basically checking, does the display name match? So I have like matches equals either it's the exact same function or the display name matches. And the reason the display name is key is like if you have an item component, but you want to be able to create a wrapper for that, you need to identify it somehow. So I have this function called create, which just assigns a display name to a component. So if you go to here, custom components, in order to create a custom component, you do drop.menu.create. And all this literally does, this create function, if you say item, is it just assigns display name of item to this. It's just like a convenience function that makes sure all the display names like live under like a private API of sorts. So you can't just like give them anything. And so if I go back and I just find the create function, I think it's somewhere around here. Display names, I believe. Yeah, so these are all the possible display names. And here I have this create function. And create literally all it does, it's just a higher order component that assigns a display name. And that's useful because then when we're traversing over items, is instance of component will point out like, hey, this is an item, even though it's not the literal item component because it was wrapped. Okay, so long-winded way of describing is instance of component, just a helper function. So when you're looping over each child of content, you can identify what kind of component it is. So then I'm like, all right, if this is instance of an item, that means that the child has menu item props on it, which means I can do child.props, right? But there's so many different kinds of props and things like combinations on a child. So instead of parsing that here, I just have item equals get item from child. So get item from child is just another helper function that's right up here that takes in an item node of any kind and returns back the fields that it would expect. And what's kind of key about this is if any of the fields aren't valid or something like that, it's just going to return null. So here we can, just say if item. And the reason that's useful is these other functions are going to use, these other cases are going to use the same stuff like get item from child. So because the drop down item and the checkbox item, they all share a lot of things like a title and menu attributes and a key and stuff like that. So I'm going to just show you this get item from child function. So this is expecting a literal React element, right? We can parse, we can do child.props. It's a really crazy thing. Again, you're reading in the children of your own component. It's a little hard to grasp, you're reading in the children of your own component. So in this case, like the content component is saying like, hey, go through my children, get the item, and then do this item's props. You know, so it's going to literally read in this item's props. Okay. So here, if I go back, all right, get item from child. And here we're just initializing all the variables that the menu item is going to need. And then I'm doing like, if the child that I'm looping through, like if the child of the item is a string, then that's the title. Otherwise, I'm then looping through the item, looking for, again, pick children. It's another like nested, just like reading the children, where the children is item title, because when you're creating an item, it has an item title. So this is like the title of the component. So I'm going to read in this title is child, which should be a string. And then there's like some extra logic for it, like it allows subtitles and other stuff like that. But that's kind of the idea. Like I'm just continually going and like reading through each component, and I'm mapping through the tree in like a very weird way. Like you shouldn't typically do this with React. It's not the greatest practice, but I just didn't know another way to do it. And I think for something like this is what React navigation does as well. When you're creating a stack, it's actually enforcing strict rules where the JSX element of the stack isn't real. Like for all intents and purposes, it's just using an array, but it's just a prettier way of viewing it because we're so used to JSX, and it's like just a nice abstraction. So here I have the icon children, and you pass it stuff like an icon name and things like that. And I parse that out and I pass it to this icon variable. So if I go up, I initialize some icon variable up here, and then at the very end, it's going to get passed to this item. So when I go to the very bottom, here I have this parsed item component as long as all these things are marked as valid. The last thing that's pretty relevant to Zego in particular is when you're using an item, you always need to pass it a key. So this is like a required prop. And that's like pretty common when you have list items and things like that. The reason the key is used is for the callback function. So these menu libraries basically have like a onPress action, like a function that like lives at the root here. And when you press an action, it gives you back like some sort of string or data that you just pressed. But in the case of Radix, when you're clicking a menu item, you actually want to pass like onSelect directly to the component. So in my case, you have a ton of different functions that all need to get mapped onto this one onPress action. So I'm using the key prop to distinguish that. So basically the last thing I do is like I have a dictionary of all the callbacks. This is just storing all the callback functions that you passed to the items. And those are all identified via a key. So whenever you pass onSelect, it's really just adding to this dictionary of callback functions, and those get called down below in onPress menu item right here. So it checks the callbacks for the key that matches, and it calls that one. And lastly, for checkbox items, we have onValueChange versus onSelect, and this is doing a few other things like this. And this is just some TypeScript stuff where it actually is able to know that this is a checkbox item based on this, because up at the top, I said that this get menu item or get item from child is going to be an element of one of these three types. It's either a subtrigger, a checkbox item, or an item. All right, so that's get item from child. That's getting called here in map items children. So you just have a basic item, or you have a checkbox item, which has its own fields. And all of these are just basically returning an array. So here I have children.map, and I'm mapping through contents children and pushing basically an array that's going to return a list of menu items or null. And then at the end, we filter these out. So I have menu items and then .filter null. It could probably be a little more efficient, not looping through it a second time and just, but it's, I found that this worked pretty well, and it's ultimately pretty fast. We've got some New York sirens in the background. So that is how we loop through these children. Again, this is like a pretty crazy behavior. Like you should definitely never do this in app code. It's a very library specific thing. I found that ultimately a menu, like you're losing some composability by breaking the rules of React like this in a way. I don't know if it's breaking them. It's more just using a private API and enforcing strict rules. But hey, it's just how it goes. I wanted to bring the Radix API to native, and this was the only way to really do it. And the complaints have been pretty low. Like people are sometimes like, wait, why can't I do nested components that easily? And that's just a trade-off. So just like last thing, let's say you have like drop-down menu dot label. So that's one of the components here, drop-down menu dot label. And if I go up to the top, that's here, inside the content, and it would show a label. If you watch the video I posted earlier, you could see an example of that. That is just once again here inside of the content. It's picking the children, looking for a label, and if the label exists, it sets it as the menu title on iOS. And then I have all these callback functions. That's just basic stuff. And this is forwarding down to an existing React Native iOS library. So I didn't build any iOS code for this. I'm wrapping existing native libraries, both there's one for iOS and one for Android. And both of them are like pretty cool libraries. And the key thing about them is they already implement native code and they have these array-based APIs, but I wanted a different kind of API, hence why I built this JSX one, and everything kind of maps on to that library itself. So basically I'm parsing all my props, turning them into variables that this other library can use and just passing them down. And that is how I built Zego. This is kind of like this crazy little hacky approach that in production works very well. I mean, there's really no problem with it as long as React never completely changes how it works. This is gonna be completely fine. And the last thing is like, okay, so this is how I did this on iOS. For Android, it's the exact same thing. It's just wrapping a different library. So notice for Android, we have the same trigger and we have an auxiliary view and all these things that just do nothing. And again, it's pretty duplicated code because the underlying libraries are different. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. This stuff is a bit duplicated, but it's very clear. I like kind of having this inline logic, especially for open source work. You'll notice that all of this is in one file, all the iOS code in one file, all the Android code in one file. We're talking about like 500 lines here. I think a lot of people would like pull these out into a bunch of helper functions and stuff. Like, I like to see right in line with the code, like what is happening. Yeah, if I change stuff, I might have to do it in both files, whatever. I think this is a nice way of doing this. I'm repeating myself here a bit on purpose, and it's very explicit, so I do like that. It's not as polymorphic, because we're mapping on two different native libraries, one for Android, one for iOS. And if we had these helper functions, we would then have to adapt it back to Android and back to iOS. Like, I just have everything in line here, and I really like it to work this way. So the last thing is like iOS and Android work this way. They have these like crazy hacks that's like mapping over the children and forwarding down to the underlying native libraries. If you're ever interested in like how to turn like an API that's array based into JSX based, this is how you would do it. Now the last thing though is what about web? Because web is just using radix, right? Remember this sort of thing here that I did. The whole point is just to make it look like radix, feel like radix, and use the same radix APIs. But I also wanted to literally implement radix on web. So if I go back here to the code, I can see that I have this folder called web primitives. This is all menu. Basically, I have a context menu and a drop-down menu in the source code. I made this a mono repo, but it actually wasn't necessary because I only have one package. You kind of, everything goes in circles. Like for a while, it was very pro mono repo. Now I think there's such a pain that like for libraries, I try to just avoid them and just have like / drop-down menu with a bit of a tree shake and export. Anyway, here I have the drop-down menu root export. And this is just, there's a web file in iOS and an Android, and then just like a plain one. This, I guess, I don't know what this would even apply to, if anything. Maybe like desktop or something. I guess if you have a desktop app, it'll just return null. I like to do this just as a fallback in case someone's using this library in some random platform in the future, like TV or who knows, and I don't want it to break. But anyway, we have drop-down menu.web. We already looked at iOS and Android, and this is just re-exporting this create iOS menu thing and create Android menu. But what about web? Well, web is actually using real components, right? Unlike traversing a tree of children and mapping over and stuff like that, on web, we can use real DOM elements using radix. So we have this root, and literally every component is just wrapping the existing radix component and adding a little compatibility. So the root is just straight up drop-down menu.root, and then the trigger is a view, but it has to forward on-click capture because on pointer down doesn't exist for the React Native view. There's just some props that don't perfectly match up. And then the trigger I'm using as child here and passing that down to a trigger view. This lets us use React Native styling on the trigger. Pretty specific little detail. You basically want to make this work with React Native Web as well. So it's not just making it the components forward, but I also needed this to have React Native Web support, which is why I made the trigger and then trigger view inside of that with as child, which just forwards the props down using radix's slot component. Then I have the content view. Again, this is, I think, what goes inside of content. Yeah. So basically, radix splits apart the portal and content. I didn't find that to be necessary to expose to users of Zego. Like, you're always going to want to use the content inside of a portal. So I just put those together. the main motivation is I don't want to have to wrap now Portal on the native side. And this was a breaking change at one point. Like they used to do this for you, but I decided to keep that behavior because I thought it was pretty reasonable. Like I don't want to have to write Portal every time for no reason. So anyway, it takes in these props. And again, there's a content component from Radix, but then I'm passing a React Native view as a child of that, just to make sure that you're able to style this content in a way that is compatible with React Native Web and like the style prop and things that you're used to. Now on native, this stuff is going to do nothing. Like if you style the content, that's going to style what the menu looks like on web. But on iOS and Android, you're going to see no difference because it's going to use the native underlying menu, right? And this is a key part of the kind of implementation details and philosophy of Zego. And you can read more about that on the docs if you want. But again, I'll just kind of keep going through these. So here we have an item component. And this is once again, just wrapping drop-down menu.item from Radix. It has, all these other props mapped onto it nicely. It even has a style that I think is just getting rid of the outline with. That's the little opinionated thing I must have done a while ago. And then I have this item primitive, which is just a React Native view that's used for drop-down menu item, context menu item, as well as the checkbox item. All these, sort of components that are used in useful ways. And I'm passing key is equal to undefined. It's just like because I required the key in the TypeScript types for the native menu, and this is expecting the item props. It thought I would have, key string. It's just a little under the hood detail, not that important. So I'm really getting into the weeds here, but I'm just kind of trying to show you these are the things that sometimes you're doing when you're building a library. You're building these workarounds. You're making a bunch of different things work so that you get this pretty nice to use API as the app consumer. Like when you're the consumer of this library and you're building an app, you see this really nice drop-down menu.root and trigger and content and all just works. On native, you see this native menu. On Radix, you get this on web, you get this animated Radix menu. But, there's a lot of stuff going on under the hood to make that happen. The checkbox item, each one of these things has a bunch of little stuff. And that is how Zego works. Zego is wrapping Radix on web, React Native iOS context menu on iOS, and React Native menu on Android. It's doing a lot of magic on the native side to make the API match. And on web, it's simply adding some React Native web compatibility to make everything work smoothly. And that's one way to build a React Native library. All the code I wrote here was JavaScript. I didn't touch a single Swift file or a single Android file because I was wrapping existing Android and iOS libraries, which already had React Native compatibility. So that's pretty nice. However, what happens when you do want to get into some native code? In particular, what happens when you want to use an existing native library for Swift or Kotlin in a React Native app, and there's no existing React Native library for it? Well, keep in mind, like React Native is just like JavaScript APIs pointing to native ones with some middleware, right? So one example I wanted to do this for was a library called Burnt. So this is a library I made for toasts in React Native. So I'll show you the video here. When I click it, it opens alerts and toasts. Now, like, where do these come from? Where does the style come from for this? And what's really cool is it shows on top of modals, and it has all this cool support. And it also works on web, right? So here you can see on web, it's using this library called Sonner. And on iOS and Android, it's using this library called SP Indicator and SP Alert, which one of them has changed its name a bit to AlertKit, but that kind of gives you the idea. Now, across platforms, looks totally different, very different idea, but you get the same API as the user, right? Like you're only writing this. And this is a very different case from Radix. Like in this case, it's a very opinionated library. You get some customization, but it's saying like you're going to kind of accept how these toasts look on each platform. It's going to be good. It's going to be native. It's going to have nice gestures, but you're going to kind of go with what exists. Okay. So how do we build this one? Well, this one did have native code. This was actually my first time, I think, using Swift. I was first tinkering around with it. So I'm going to open that one next. So here I have Burnt open. And what this library does is it wraps, my previous library was wrapping two React Native libraries and just providing a nicer syntax to them and giving web compatibility and doing some things like that and doing some magic to let you map JSX to arrays. This one's doing something a little bit different. This one is actually wrapping an iOS library or a few iOS libraries, okay? So what I found was I like this library called SP Indicator. I saw this and it's a Swift library, right? There's no React Native compatibility for this. And I was like, okay, well, I mean, the code looks pretty simple. Like I really like Swift, to be honest. I think there's a lot of similarity with JavaScript, and some of it is pretty minimalist. Like I love this thing where you can just do dot something, and you don't need to like put the class ahead of it because it can just infer what it is based on the value it's expecting. Like I think that is just so cool. So preset dot error, in JavaScript you need to do, if you're doing some sort of enum or something like that, you'd have to do like SP indicator preset dot error. But this is just a really nice API. I've just truly fallen in love with that. All this looked very intuitive to me. So I was thinking like, okay, how can I get this to work in React Native? I was like, all right, like how do I get, the Swift code running there? I'm not sure where these docs are, but somewhere around here, I could create a native module. And, I just kind of started with the hello world and wanted to figure out what to do. So my goal was, I knew what I wanted the API to be like. So I always kind of start there, like what is it going to look like? And I wanted to have like a toast function, an alert, and a dismiss. So the first thing I did is I just went in the Swift file. And in the pod spec, I installed these dependencies. So these are those two Swift libraries I was mentioning. So you just kind of do like s.dependency, and I put these in the pod file. If you know iOS stuff, it's gonna be like your npm, but I'd never done this before, so I was just kind of learning on the fly. I didn't really know how dependencies are managed. Apparently, CocoaPods is actually not cool anymore. I've heard the iOS people say it's like the old way of doing things, and here in React Native world, we're still apparently using this for our package managing on the Swift side, but I don't know. I don't make the rules. I like this prettier thing where they have like the equals being there. I think that's a nice convention. This reminds me of the prettier world of JavaScript. Like I feel like we used to all kind of do this on our own manually. I think we should bring that back. Anyway, so into the code. Here we have burnt module.swift. So again, I'm wrapping this React Native library and I want to make it work. I'm wrapping this iOS library to make it work in React Native. So here I just have like a bunch of stuff like enum mappers. So, when you're passing a prop from React Native, you're giving it a string. So let's say I go to iOS here. This is the function that exposes this native library to JavaScript. So I'm using a require native module, which is calling in burnt, and that's going to go to this burnt module.swift file. So I'll show you that in a second. And then, there's a little bit of helper function, but this is like 30 lines, so all the code really lives on the native side, and everything else in JavaScript is like just straight up forwarding the functions. So in JavaScript, like you create this, these three functions, toast, alert, and whatever. And then you're just importing the iOS library using require native module with a string. That's the name of the module. And then you're calling the functions that it exposed. So on the iOS side, I have toast async, alert async, and dismiss alerts async. There's like a convention with native stuff of putting async at the end. Personally, I actually don't like it. I think it's pretty ugly. But so that's why when I actually expose this to users publicly, the function's just called toast. But the internal name is toast async to make it clear that the native communication is async versus sync, especially now that you can use sync functions. Anyway, back to burnt module.ios. Here we're just mapping a few props down. But what's important is when you're calling toast and you give it some options, you have these things right here. So you have one option is like you pass it a title and a message. But what I want to focus on is the preset. So when you pass a preset to a native library, you're giving a string. Okay. But Swift has like actual strict types, and like, don't kill me on the terminology here because I might not get some of this stuff wrong, but from what I know, they have like literal enums that are used for things like this. I think it's probably a bit different than TypeScript enums, which are just like some sort of weird magic that you should never use, in my opinion. Notice that like the preset, I'm just passing like done or error or custom. But on the Swift side, you need to like take in a string and convert it to the real enum. So for every single enum that the SB indicator library expects, like when I'm calling, let's see, this is the actual burnt module, right? So here I have my functions like toast async and alert sync, and all these are doing are receiving the props from the JavaScript side and calling it into some native library. So there's this, let's see, options.preset.toSP indicator preset, right? So this is just a way to convert those JavaScript strings and other things like that into valid enums that can be used on the native side. So this is just kind of happening with a little like try catch thing. And then it checks if the view can be created or not. And yeah, this could probably be made a little bit prettier. But basically, I have this options.preset.toSP indicator preset. And again, I'm looking at this in VS Code. You should probably do this in Xcode. But the first time I did this, I was straight up writing Swift in VS Code and just restarting the dev server. Like I didn't even, I don't know. I didn't have the perfect setup. I've now started to kind of tinker with using Xcode for it, but whatever. This is like 250 lines. I wanted to get it done. What's the big difference? So I have this thing for toast preset that turns those strings, we have all these cases, into an SP indicator preset. So notice here that this is like super cool to me. The return type is SP indicator preset or icon preset. So when I return .done, it knows to return SP indicator icon preset .done. That is just so cool to me. Like I literally love that. I think that's awesome. So again, every time you have an enum you're passing, you just create this like enum string enumerable. I think this requires having imported Expo modules core, because I think they have some helper functions. Like I believe enumerable is an Expo modules core thing, or I'm wrong and that's just a Swift built-in functionality. I'm honestly not sure. I'm far from a Swift expert, but I managed to kind of get this thing together and working. So definitely use ChatGPT to help you out if you're doing this for the first time. You can make a whole library. I'd never done Swift before, but it's not that hard for basic stuff, which is kind of cool, especially if you're not doing a view-based library. So this is just a module, which is to say I'm not like wrapping a React Native view and doing anything with it. I do have another library for iOS that I just made that does that, which I can share in a second, but the code for that isn't public yet, so I'll probably wait on that. You can read through the code for this if you want. Burnt is open source, and you'll basically see like, all right, we take some presets and then we forward them into like valid enum values for Swift from strings. So like, for example, the side, you can present a toast at the top or bottom of the screen. And so case top or bottom, that's just a string. And if it's, if it's a top, then it returns SP indicator preset side top. And yeah, so then here, the options.preset, because it's, it turns it into that from the options. And that's pretty much it. So here we just, extract all these values from the preset, and then we just kind of follow the code from the iOS library. So up next, they just say like, okay, SP indicator.present. So I was like, all right, I'll just call SP indicator.present. But then I got some like queuing issues and something about it being sync or async. So I asked Tamaz from Expo, or from Software Mansion, and he told me to add this run on queue main. No idea what it did at the time, but it solved the problem for me. And now, basically it calls this view.present thing. And I set the side, I just kind of set all these properties on it. And that's why I have the native code working for it. So the other things to keep in mind, when you're initializing an Expo module, there's this is kind of a gotcha for me. There's this file called expomodule.config.json. You got to make sure that this maps onto the files that you're using. So at one point inside of the iOS folder, I added something that like wasn't burnt module.swift. I had put some other name and it just like wasn't working, and I couldn't figure it out for the life of me. I think that Expo uses this for like linking native code to JavaScript. I'm not totally sure exactly how it works, but you can tell the name of the modules map on here to either the file name or the Swift name here. I found it really weird in Swift how you like don't always have to import stuff, or like you can just import the name of the library and you don't have to like explicitly tie it to a variable. Like I think JavaScript, what it has going for it is it's much more explicit what you're actually using. This kind of reminds me of the old days of JavaScript where we have like global files or global, prototype overrides instead of these useful modules. I wasn't a big fan of that. But anyway, here this class is overriding module, which I assume comes from Expo modules core. Again, Swift is kind of unclear with where those things are getting imported from. But that's just how it works. So this dismiss all alerts async function, it's literally just calling SP alert dismiss. That's it. It's so simple. And then here, like on the iOS side, on the JavaScript side, I just call that. So burnt module dismiss all alerts async is calling this right here. So Expo has a sync, function and async function helpers. And, it gets a little more complicated if you want to build a native view. This is just a native module, and then you can have a native module with a view. This is never rendering a view because you're just calling it imperatively, like the toasts are imperative. And just like for completeness sake, I'll show you on Android. We're using toast Android from React Native. This is so classic, right? We have a toast Android function, like the no iOS counterpart. It's so funny to me that this lives in React Native, and it's like this really ugly toast component. Like, I wonder if it's on the Expo docs. They used to just wrap the React Native docs. Let's see. Toast Android. Yeah, look at this. This is just a hilarious component. This little thing, and like that's it. And like I don't know. I just thought that was really funny. I didn't really feel like getting to learn Kotlin, and I just wasn't really, I don't know, Android wasn't a top priority for me at the time, so I just bailed out and used this Toast Android component. There are a lot of people in the library issues who have asked, like, hey, can we have a really pretty Android one, just like the iOS one? And probably unbeknownst to them, I didn't like create the iOS code. I didn't like style it or anything like that. I just wrapped an existing Toast library. I think on the burnt docs or on the burnt GitHub, there's an Android. Yeah, here we've talked about, someone was like, can we do it with, reanimated? And my whole take is like, I would rather use native libraries for this. I want to kind of push people to use more native code in React Native. There's kind of this old way of doing things, which is like, I'm going to make a JavaScript only library and everything works across platforms and stuff. And you end up with these components that like feel like janky Flutter to me. Like, I've seen this with a lot of low level primitives. People will have like 10,000 lines of gesture handler logic that in like 20 lines of native code with some existing library would be 10 times better. And we do it, I think, in large part because Expo used to not allow us to use native code. So there used to be like two forms of React Native coding. You're either using Expo or you're using like React Native CLI or Expo Bear or whatever it used to be called. And so now that things have changed, like that mode of thinking at the library side should really change. You'll notice that a lot of React Native libraries are just not maintained anymore. They get left by the wayside, like no one pays any attention to them. And I think the reason is because the very impactful ones used native code, and it was always like such a pain to deal with writing Objective-C and Java and like dealing with like every release would break something. Now that Expo has a first-class way of building libraries, I think this has changed a lot. Like you can write Swift and Kotlin files. It works with the new architecture. I'm sure there's some sort of trade-off to it. Like you have to install Expo modules into the consuming app, which like some people are still hesitant to do. I think it's just like such a trade-off that's necessary for library developers. Like I don't see myself not building a library with Expo modules because it means you can maintain it forever. Now there are good alternatives out there. I've seen React Native Bob as one. I personally really like Expo modules for writing the native code side. I think the trade-offs that do exist so far in my experience are pretty easy to work around. I've really liked it. So anyway, I think this is a good suggestion, of course, to use reanimated for Toast, but I would rather use a native Android Toast. Now, I did close this issue because I don't really have any plans to do this at the time. Obviously, making this video, I'm kind of like, maybe I should make a nicer Android Toast. So the way I'm thinking about it is like I could just go on the Android docs and be like, okay, they have this built-in Toast component, but it's not like that nice. We could probably find something better. So then I think someone commented on here a library, Toast Utils. Kind of can't read any of this language, but it seems like maybe this is another option. This is like clearly, I don't know if this is a Kotlin library. It looks like Java. That looks like Java. So yeah, there's got to be a nicer Android library. Like on Zego, there's also an issue to add like a nicer looking Android library. Like in my opinion, built-in Android designs are just like an eyesore. I don't know who could get hired from the iOS team to completely make material design look different. I mean, it's really, you want a good example. Look at the built-in native menu on Android versus iOS. On iOS, it's like a work of art. This perfect animation. It like covers the context menu, hides the underlying previewed components so well. You can drag it around. And on Android, it's just this like white rectangle. Anyway, that's a bit of the problem that I think you run into with these Android situations. So, it still works on Android. I'm wrapping it just like the built-in React Native component here. It was a bit of a tangent. We have this toast async function, and alert async is just calling that same one. I haven't really put in a lot of work in finding a good Android library for the toasts, but this should give you a simple idea. Like you can, in 200 lines, and this could have been half that if I had fewer features, you can wrap an iOS library, call it from your JavaScript side here, and boom, like you got a React Native library. I'm working on this thing called Galleria. I think I'm gonna make it like a sponsors only library. It's been a lot of work, and I'm getting like a bit overwhelmed of having so many GitHub notifications across all these projects, and people really expect a lot. So in order to keep it maintainable, I might try to find a more sustainable approach to it. But anyway, here's Galleria. It pops up. It is this really nice, and this is a native library. And what's cool is like, I didn't really build much native code for it. I'm actually just wrapping an existing Swift library. Pretty underrated. I don't think people consider enough how much easier this is. And I think it's kind of funny. I'll give a quick shout out. I saw Dan Abramov post on Twitter like a few weeks ago that he was working on like an image viewer component now that he's working at Blue Sky. And he's like spending like weeks working on the gestures for Android and the pinch and the whatever and all this stuff. And like I was looking up libraries for an image gallery like this. And this is what you'll find. You'll find people who have spent so much time sweating over these details, fighting the fact that like React Native is just like pushing against you at every step to make this easy. And I'm like Googling all this stuff and I'm like, ah, man, like I just don't know what to do, like to find a good image viewer. And I was like, all right, well, what if I just look up a Swift library? Like, why do I need to look up a React Native image viewer? Do I need an existing React Native library? I never really thought of that too much before, but like you could say like the Overton window of like open source ideas has kind of changed for me. Where now I'm like, well, what about a Swift library? So this is a Swift library that's getting wrapped, and I swear it's like under 70 lines of code or something like that. Like it took me like no time to set up. The only issue I had with setting it up actually was I forget what there was something that wasn't working about it, but it was like a minor detail. Like had I done one thing differently, I would have literally had this component working in like under an hour. There are like thousands of React Native developers, so many smart people. Think of all the hours that went to like getting gesture handler to work when you could just like Google like Swift library and then map it. Like that, like it's really kind of crazy. I'm not going to share the code for this one quite yet. I haven't decided if this is going to be a public library or not. We'll see. But here you can see it also works on web. So here, ironically enough, I'm actually using Framer Motion, and this is a custom implementation. The expectations on iOS and I guess Android, but more so iOS, are like your product has to be completely slick. It's got to be buttery at every stop, which is why I really like using Swift-based libraries, because Swift developers have such a high standard for design, I've found, because there are such strict rules. And a lot of the time they get to inherit these existing beautiful primitives from Swift that are so close to the metal and how you should design. Like when you first start coding with React Native and this stuff, like I came from web and I was creating everything from scratch because that's what I was used to on the web. You just like put a bunch of divs up and add some gestures and listeners. But for iOS, like you got to have a little bit of a different standard, I think, which is why I thought this was really cool to do the native library. This is a view-based one. So I'll kind of leave you with that. I've been talking for a while. I don't actually know how long this has been going. Let's see, it's 45 minutes. It'll probably be a little less if I chop some of the stuff out. Hopefully this gives you a bit of an overview of like how I build libraries in React Native, what I like to think about. With Burnt, I'm just wrapping a Swift library. With Zego, I was wrapping an iOS an iOS and Android counterparts, both of them being React Native libraries with native code. Don't be scared of using native code, right? And create an Expo module, look at the Swift file, and like just look up some existing Swift library that you think would be cool. It doesn't have to work the exact same on iOS, Android, web. Maybe it's an iOS only library, right? But you should be able to use these native primitives that are out there. Just think of all the people who have built awesome libraries for Swift. With Xcode and Expo modules, you can actually do it somewhat easily. I really think this is like not been as big of a turning point in the React Native world as it should have been. Like once Expo launched development clients and pre-build and other things that I think could have better names but are pretty revolutionary, you can use native code in an Expo library, in an Expo app, or in a React Native CLI app. There's actually no fundamental difference there. And on the Expo side, you can even use config plugins. So if you're building a library that like has some extra native steps, you can put it into a plugin. So then consumers aren't going to be like blowing up your issues all day being like, hey, help me with like my Gradle file, if that's the way you pronounce that. I don't actually know. I think this has to get used more, and people have to just think a bit more like, oh, what native library could I use for this? Should I do that? Would that be easy? And then it usually is. Like it's truly so unexpected how much easier it is to like get a ChatGPT file with some Swift code, wrapping some existing library and mapping it to JavaScript. It's going to take you a lot less time. And I don't know, it's been a cool experience for me to learn a little bit of Swift. It's much more similar to JavaScript than I would have expected, and TypeScript in general. Clearly, TypeScript, I think, has taken some ideas from Swift in a good way. So try it out. Try using Expo modules. Consider these different options. I have some problem I want to solve. What are the best options out there for each platform? When I was doing Zego, I wanted to build menus. Well, Radix has the best menus. And iOS built-in has the best menus. And Android, the built-in menus are pretty ugly. They're just white squares. But, to be seen if I'll have time to make a better library on the native side for Android. But look at each platform, think, well, like, what would the best outcome be? And before just trying to do a bunch of complicated stuff in JavaScript for very low-level UI primitives, look to the native side. Because after all, we're building native apps.